Well, dear friends and colleagues, my name is Andreas Corcoran. I'm the Deputy Secretary General of the International Association of Universities, and we're delighted to welcome you to this webinar on knowledge diplomacy in a changing world. How timely and necessary it is for us to take stock and discuss how knowledge generators, such as universities, can contribute to bridging differences and hopefully contribute to building trust and perhaps a more forceful commitment to human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, among others. We are witnessing yet another year of geopolitical tensions, wars, grave human rights violations, democratic backsliding, distrust in public institutions, terrorism, uncharted upheaval through artificial intelligence, as well as the enduring threat of the global climate crisis. Universities are facing the emergence of a multipolar world with the emergence of geopolitical blocks and increased fragmentation. The essence of IAU is to foster international collaboration and dialogue. It has been doing so for over 70 years, and we're convinced that nations and their respective higher education systems can find solutions to these pressing issues, but they cannot do so on their own. To do so, we must also overcome the paradoxical tensions that come within higher education, that of constantly competing with each other while also being in some sort collaborating. We're thus delighted to have this webinar today to address burning questions as to how universities can leverage their influence, stem breakdowns in civic discourse, build a sense of interconnectedness, foster intercultural competencies, find their role to build collaboration across borders and cultures. As citadels of inquiry, analysis, and innovation, universities must continuously build and prove their diplomatic competencies to effectively carry out their mission, leverage their role in society and beyond their national borders, as custodians of knowledge, as centers of interculturality. In that vein, we are very, very glad to have a fantastic panel of speakers here today. And we're doing so today in collaboration with Mary Clark of the Centre or the Study Centre for the Study of Higher Education at University College Dublin. And we're very glad for carrying out this partnership together today. We also have on our panels today for formidable thinkers in the area of diplomatic knowledge diplomacy. And we are speaking here today with Mary Clark, the Dean of Undergraduate Studies at University College Dublin, Joe Beale, Emeritus Professor and Distinguished Policy Fellow, London School of Economics and Political Science, and the Vice Chair at ZOAS. She's there on the Board of Trustees, and especially for today's conversation, I'm sure, Director, Education and Cultural Engagement at the British Council. We also have Vasiliki Papatsiba. She's a reader at the School of Social Sciences and Cardiff University, and least but certainly not last, Tim Gore, Chief Executive Officer at the University of London Institute in Paris, France. Very warm welcome, and we're really looking forward to a very vibrant discussion today. And it gives me great pleasure that Marie Clark will be taking over the chairing of this particular session. And I'll pass the floor over to Marie right now. Just to let me tell you that there is a chance to engage with our panelists today through the chat function especially. So please be free, get engaged, ask your questions, and we will make time at the end of this session to address those. So Marie, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And just to say that the Centre for the Study of Higher Education here in UCD is delighted to be co-hosting this webinar with the IAU in terms of the issues around knowledge diplomacy and its importance. So maybe we'll get the ball rolling, and I'll say to you, Joe, do you think should universities be promoting knowledge, science and cultural diplomacies? And if yes, what are the benefits of adopting such an approach and what are the challenges?
So the short answer is yes. For centuries, scholars have communicated across borders, and in the arts, culture, science, all these areas have been used to inspire hearts and minds. They've underpinned nationalist movements and celebrated religious passions, reflected cultural identities. So it happens anyway. But I would argue that attempts to artificially harness the soft power of art, culture, and science can be crass, can lose meaning and potency if it becomes close to propaganda. In today's world, in the contemporary context, we are living in unprecedented times, as Andreas has said, and moving on from a kind of cultural relations approach, which we exercised at the British Council when I was director there. Knowledge diplomacy presumes a wider number of actors. So in addition to teachers, researchers, internationally mobile students, knowledge diplomacy involves users of research, innovators, and so on. And thus it becomes more complex because you're not just looking at a single ecosystem or epistemic community of interested scholars cooperating across borders, but a broader group of people. And it can become complex. It can become complex, particularly in an era where knowledge economies are competing with each other for information, for understanding, for knowledge and innovation, and where suspicion over things like intellectual property rights can emerge. But I would say, in concluding this section of my remarks, I would say that never before has the global community needed cooperation amongst scholars and innovators as much as it does now. The global challenges we face, from international pandemics to climate change, require the best brains and the best kind of cooperation. And that requires that we foster this kind of knowledge diplomacy, despite some of the difficulties in making it happen, or involving a broader set of actors than perhaps the lone medieval scholars faced in the past.
All right, thank you, Joe. Tim, do you have any views on that? Or?
Thank you, Marie, and thank you, Joe, for a fantastic introduction. I work for the University of London in the Institute in Paris, and we have a knowledge diplomacy project that spans Paris and London. And it's been fascinating listening to the range of contributors that the project has brought in, because it is a really open concept and a concept that's disputable, knowledge diplomacy, but it does seem to be a concept that also opens up the space for interdisciplinarity and as a meeting point between theory and practice. And I think that's one of the crucial roles that universities can play. Of course, it's very difficult to generalize about universities, and our hosts, the International Association of Universities, will know this better than anyone, that there are many different types of universities, and they play lots of different roles. Some are close to the state that they belong to. Some of them can cross barriers more easily than others, and some are more independent. But they are quite unique organizations. And I've worked for universities now for going on 12, 13 years. And before that, like Joe, I was with the British Council for 20 years. So I've been intimately associated with universities over the whole of this period. And I do find them absolutely fascinating organizations, because that mix of porosity, that mixture of knowledge creators, but also knowledge educators, I think is a really potent mix. They're quite unique in the sense that they have responsibility not only for production of knowledge, and very often production of knowledge in quite an unrestrained way that is very difficult to replicate in other organizations. I wouldn't say totally unrestrained, because of course every university has its own constraints, and a little later on I might talk about how universities are sort of tied to their national home in many different and complex ways. So it does make them party pro in a way. But at the same time, they provide a space for people to learn about knowledge, and obviously are involved in higher learning skills, which give access to the sort of knowledge that Joe was talking about, that we need to solve these complex problems. And they also provide a home for scholars, a home for thinkers, a home for people involved in these global challenges, even though the people involved might not necessarily spend the whole of their time within the university teaching, researching. They may have roles in United Nations bodies, climate change bodies, all sorts of different international and cross-border organizations, but very often the home is a university, and that provides them freedom to act in that way. And I think that's very valuable. I think there's a lot to be said, but I'll stop there for the moment and give others a chance to contribute.
Thank you very much. And Vasiliki, in terms of your perspective.
Yes, thank you, Marie. Thank you to Joe and team. I think these are really powerful comments, and I do like our very balanced and nuanced approach, because we all try to advocate knowledge diplomacy, but we're also, I think, aware of the challenges and aware also that there are boundaries that have to be negotiated. For me, the question really highlights, that critical intersection between higher education and international relations, and also the fact that universities need to consider the space not only as one dimension, but they have to sort of engage in thinking around socio-spatial relations that involve territories, places, scales, and networks. So I think that's kind of invites us to leave aside that monolithic thinking, because there are different notions of space, but there are also different actors and different forces. So it also, I think, knowledge diplomacy, I think, also invites for sort of added reflexivity, and the universities are uniquely sort of positioned not only to discuss and point out when there are sort of power structures and relationships that are not equal, but also how the different types of knowledges have been generated. They can question their knowledge production, their practices, and they can also try to understand how these knowledges and practices have been sort of emerged, involved, and influenced by socio-spatial relations. So it's a very interesting contested term, contested practice, nevertheless very interesting, and I couldn't imagine a better forum with or with an audience that comes from across the globe to bring our understandings together and to say that these are very contextual understandings, and you might want to see if there are some principles that we share or we would like to sort of advocate for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vasiliki. Thank you. I mean, Joe, you've done a lot of work on cities and higher education and knowledge diplomacy. I mean, could you tell us a little bit about that in terms of the uniqueness of that perspective?
Thank you, Marie. Yes, I think there's often quite a synergy between the way in which universities and research institutions project themselves and the way cities do. And sometimes they're more comfortable bedfellows than the scholarly community and nation states. The scholarly community can easily feel slightly manipulated or orchestrated or over-engineered when it comes to how they're used in public diplomacy. Whereas with cities, the interests often coincide. So, for example, in a city like London, where I live, the city is interested in attracting students, not just for the money they bring, but the way they add vibrancy and diversity and cultural engagement and exchange to the city, all of which London as a capital prides itself on. And where it contributes, I think, to soft power and the soft power of London as a city is that those students go home, hopefully, mostly with a love of London. Some of them will have a lousy experience and a horrible landlord or something, but most of them will go home with a real affection for their alma mater and the city where they came into adulthood and spread their wings. So from the point of view of students and universities, there is a great affinity, and Tim will know better than I that sometimes you can have these knowledge parks, these endeavors where neighborhoods of a city or cities and universities collaborate. Mm. From the perspective of the city, many will actively engage in international collaborations for the benefit of their local economy. So if you take a city like Bristol, where there's an aerospace industry, researchers will come into that city, they will create employment for that city, and you get a virtuous circle. Cities like Melbourne actively work to attract high quality graduates, students and graduates, to contribute not only to their own economy in the short and immediate term, but long-term trading partners. So there is that synergy, and in addition, they engage in knowledge diplomacy in a less structured way. They have fewer tools at their disposal compared to, say, national governments. You know, they might host an Olympic Games to bring attraction and a focus on them, but they can't do it on their own in a way that a national government can. So I would say that one of the reasons that this synergy exists between universities, research centers, and cities is because they work within frameworks that lend themselves more easily to collaborative approaches and cooperation, which is absolutely at the center of successful soft power. As Mr. Keel has said, we're talking about operating in contexts where there's often power imbalances and so on. Those are much more easy to negotiate in flatter, more contained structures.
That's very interesting, Joe. Thanks very much. Tim, in terms of your perspective on that, similar views, similar perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I love your report, Joe, that you've been involved with. I think it's really interesting and throws up lots and lots of questions. I've worked quite a lot with the ex-mayor of Rome, who was instrumental a little while ago in setting up the mayor's network across Europe, which has functioned ever since. But what he told me was surprising was that there hadn't been anything before, that cities didn't speak to each other across Europe, and that seems quite a vacuum, really, because they really do need to. And one of the seminars that we hosted had city planners from a variety of cities, from Berlin, from Paris, from Toronto, and so on, and they were talking about the need for cities to act in tandem, because otherwise the technology companies that are actively mapping and planning cities according to their own particular version of what the future should look like will quite simply just dominate each city in as they roll out different sort of mobility schemes and we've all seen examples of this. And recently, scooters were taken off the streets of Paris because of the accident rate and for various other reasons. And really questions about their real sustainability. So it's really, really important in this respect for cities to be talking to each other. And I think Joe's absolutely right on that. And the other thing is, of course, cities have very close relationships with their universities. In the University of London, for example, hosts a research policy network, which brings together all of the researchers involved in research about London as an urban centre and urbanisation generally, and some of the planners for London. And again, this is what knowledge diplomacy is all about. It's about building bridges between practice, between policy, and between academia. And I think our responsibility as universities is to be fostering that and fostering a wider understanding of the knowledge that we're involved in creating and distributing, and making sure that is spread widely. And of course, cities are, as Joe points out, a very important component there. I'll leave it at the moment.
Yeah, and I mean, we have such an important say as universities, as actors in that particular space, in terms of trying to promote what we do. And of course, the research that's done in universities is also part and parcel of the development and the support of the city infrastructure.
Very much so.
Okay, awesome. I suppose in moving on to, and I mean, it's the theme.
Marie, maybe I can, if I can just add something, because I think that angle of cities just brought to mind some sort of points that we identified in a project that doesn't have to do with our topic today. It was mostly about the perceived effects of Brexit on higher education. And when we did the interviews, we selected a number of universities across the UK. And when we did the interviews in Northern Ireland, I was really struck by the powerful comments of one of our interviewees, who said that the Erasmus, participating in the Erasmus program, was what he felt had put Belfast on the map as an acceptable cultural destination, a city where there is knowledge. And before the beginning of Erasmus, there was this apprehension that is not safe. That's not a place where you would like to go as a student. And he also felt that through that Erasmus there was that communication, that sort of the local students were able to access the world, as it were, and at the same time there was also this possibility of crossing borders between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And that was and progressively a kind of a chain of connections and understanding was forged. And a kind of that example of the importance of those links and that openness through all sorts of changes, including intercultural changes to some extent, although how we understand that intercultural can be different. But yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
A wonderful point, the Erasmus piece, in terms of exposing cities and the centrality of that as well. Yes, which does lead on really to the next theme, I suppose, Joe, in terms of knowledge diplomacy, the role that it plays in intercultural dialogue. And of course, that's one of the main themes of the IAU conference in Doha this year, the promotion of intercultural dialogue, notably from the point of mutual understanding and developing shared understandings, which is challenging in and of its own right.
Yes, I think, if you think about intercultural dialogue or cultural relations, as the British Council has called it, that's in a way much broader than knowledge diplomacy. Knowledge diplomacy would be a part of that. Intercultural dialogue can include sport, it can include architecture, food, and all sorts of other spheres, as well as education. I think the important part of education in intercultural dialogue is precisely because it has become so internationalized. So in a city like London, where students come from all over the world, that's very obvious to see. But as important is the mobility of students to other countries from other countries everywhere. So, you know, Malaysia would be a very good example. It's having set itself up as a higher education hub for the Southeast Asian region, but more generally. And you are getting such a more open, appreciative, and knowledgeable cohort of young people coming through these various hubs. But I also want to not only emphasize students and student mobility, important though that is, especially in the context of intercultural dialogue, but also, you know, the way people communicate and develop intercultural understanding through knowledge diplomacy. I've just come off another webinar meeting where someone was picked up by someone from Africa for using the term Global South. And there was a big debate on, you know, who created that title, that nomenclature, who owned it, who should challenge it, and so on. And I think as we move into much more of this kind of engagement, we develop greater understanding, greater respect for each other. And heaven knows we need it more now than ever at the moment. I mean, at SOAS, University of London, where I'm a trustee on the board, students are tearing themselves apart in their pain and their trauma and their vengeance over the situation in the Middle East. And we've got to make sure that as we think about intercultural dialogue and as that bleeds into knowledge diplomacy, that we find ways of communicating even when emotions run high and anger prevails.
Thank you, Joe. Tim, any?
Yeah, can I just pick up on the mobility point and not to belittle the more important point you made after that, but picking up on the mobility first. I suppose that in a way we have perhaps a slightly inflated view of what mobility actually is. Certainly in sort of flows of international students, the percentage of students, of higher education students worldwide who get to be mobile is dismally small. I think pre-pandemic, we were at just over 2% of the global higher education population moving around. A lot of this mobility is from a local venue to a more regional venue. So sometimes that's a little bit invisible as well. Of course, you know, cities like London and Paris attract a very large number of international students, but lots of cities, as we heard earlier, don't. There's a danger of believing that mobility is more prevalent than it is, and that it's widely spread, and it's not widely spread. It's quite sort of focused on particular types of students in particular places and particular destinations and feeders. It is diversifying, and it has diversified greatly over the past few years, and that's great. But then came the pandemic, and of course everything ground to a halt. And we really don't have statistics of what's happened since then. The statistics haven't caught up on higher education mobility anyway. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. But I think it's really important for us as universities and as global communities to think through what the next generation of mobility will look like, because it can't be what it was. It's got to be something new. We all agree that mobility is a really, really important part of intercultural relations, really, really important for the circulation of knowledge, really, really important for individual development. But there's increasing consciousness that you can't just travel has to be measured against the cost of the environment. We have to take the carbon footprint into consideration when we do in any plans for mobility in the future, and we need to think through these things. I mean, I do think that one of the underrated sides of university work that some universities have deeply invested in, which are campuses overseas, networks of partnerships overseas, can help us in that respect, because it fosters very, very deep relationships and very, very knowing relationships about culture, about approaches to higher education, and it forces those universities concerned. The pioneers like Nottingham spring to mind, and I know that Nottingham University is also greatly involved in knowledge diplomacy as well, perhaps for that very reason, but they thoroughly internationalize themselves through working on campuses. I know there's controversy over campus, how campuses are conceived, but I think ultimately they are lessons in understanding and lessons in interrelationships, and there's an enormous amount to be learned. So I think we need to think through mobility, and we need to think through other ways of achieving the same ends or different types of mobility. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much. That's great. Joe, did you want to come back in, or?
Yeah, I just wanted to support what Tim has said, and to say that a lot of the bad press that transnational education got, mainly around bricks and mortar campuses overseas, the problem of flying faculty coming in for a week and not really being committed, displacing existing national efforts at higher education building. A lot of that has been re-questioned, and some recent work by Janet Ilieva, who is an education analyst in the UK, has shown that transnational education in country has had huge benefits for widening access, widening participation, increasing diversity, and allowed particularly, for example, women to engage in education or to look at the world in ways that they weren't formerly exposed to. So I would just want to support Tim's point very vigorously.
That's very, very true. Siliki, you have any reflections?
Yes, having sort of looked at student mobility earlier in my career, I think there are several points that sort of resonate with Tim and Joe that I wanted to make. One is that although it does seem that we get more and more students on the move, I think that's just a reflection of massification of higher education. The percentage hasn't really changed. As higher education becomes more accessible to broader sort of cohorts of students, so do mobility opportunities. So yeah, the percentage of those who remains quite flat. However, there are some differences about where students go, and maybe there is more questioning about that hegemonic sort of attraction of big countries that are considered as sort of core magnets of mobility. So I think that is diversifying, and there are some sort of new regions that appear to sort of either want to attract. They have strategies, they have cultural links, and so on. So maybe we need also to keep an eye or that sort of region, or how those poles of attraction do diversify. I think that was, and the other is that I mean, I have been trying to think for decades, how can we that the physical mobility does have the limitations that we know, and as we become also climate aware and want to contribute to sustainability, we kind of question the movement of students through that angle as well. But at the same time, I think it's still quite a formative experience for those young people who were going through a period of their lives that are quite sort of, they're keen to absorb. It's time of self-formation. And I think it's what sometimes worries me is that if that sort of biographical project becomes just part of consumerism. So students sort of consume mobilities, they consume all these fashions, and whether they're aware what's happening to them, or what is happening to their context, as at the same time as they experience that. So I'm slightly concerned about that rise of consumerism in mobility, and I think universities and also how what's happening within university shapes that experience of students when they come and they think that they want to be part of international cohorts, and they arrive there just with other connationals, and they might think, oh, what are the university's motives for me to be here? So I think there is a need for universities to give back to those students, which is difficult, when we know how much international higher education cross-subsidizes, home students or research or other things. Yeah, these were my thoughts for now.
That's interesting. Tim, thank you, Vasiliki. Tim, you wanted to come back in there?
Yeah, if I don't mind, Vasiliki's very thought-provoking point tempted me to jump back in, so apologies for that. Of course, the experience that a student gets when they are mobile is without parallel, I think, and I know that firsthand, because almost all of our students here in our very small institute in Paris are mobile students, and they come. Two of them came, they were 17 years old. They're just breaking 18, I think, this month. They come for 3 years with us on an undergraduate degree, and it's life enhancing. It's about learning new things, as you do at university, but it's also about learning the language, it's about learning the culture, it's about crossing borders. And epistemologically, it's a stimulus for learning, because systems are different, ways of thinking are different, educational philosophies are different, and that provokes different ways of thinking and helps to catalyze different ways of thinking. So I think that's really, really important. And so I do think there are ways that you can think about mobility. What worries me is that there seems to be a tendency towards short-term mobility, and the rather poor Erasmus replacement in the UK, the Turing scheme, seems to be promoting this more than Erasmus did, which Erasmus was pretty much focused on longer term mobility and tended to underpin all sorts of other relationships as well, which I'll come on to in a second. But if students are going for a considerable length of time, then the impact on the climate is much less. It's mitigated by the fact that of all of the benefit that you've got there in a long-term association. And of course, if you do it regionally, you can often travel by train or boat or some other sustainable form of transport, which I think is, again, something that we should be thinking about. And just to close, I do think that the experiments in the European universities, which were started about 6 years ago now, and really starting to build up, are really, really interesting, because they're large-scale transnational projects that are trying to break down barriers across a large number of countries. Luckily, some of the UK ones managed to become members before Brexit, and have remained members of these networks. King's College, one of them, and those are forces for breaking down the cross-border barriers that we're all up against. So I think, there's hope in regional examples like that. I know the Latin American regional examples as well, and many others that we can look at.
In terms of the intercultural dialogue piece and the shared understanding. I suppose, Vasiliki, if I come to you, in terms of knowledge science and cultural diplomacies, like, how do you think they collectively enable universities to, we'll say, exhibit their distinctiveness, and or they shape and influence the national or international policy context, and maybe more importantly of all, develop a compelling vision for their students, faculty and stakeholders? I mean, that's coming out of mobility, that's coming out of alliances and shared relationships. But, what would your view be on that?
Yeah, thank you, Marie. I think you do bring together different concepts that are related, but are slightly distinct. And I think it's important to kind of consider them in their combination. So we did discuss knowledge diplomacy and what it involves. We had Joe's and team's sort of introductory comments. When it comes to science diplomacy, I think we kind of understand it more as the international scientific partnerships that foster cooperation, and with aim also of addressing the global challenges. But also I think the aim is also to foster sort of mutual understanding and to contribute to policy discussions in specific areas like climate change, health, sustainable development, and so on. I think what is key here is that if universities sort of by engaging in that knowledge diplomacy, that universities shouldn't just seek to enhance their reputation, because that's often the main driver, given the competitiveness. There's always that sort of binary sort of collaboration and competition. But I think as they enhance their reputation, they can also sort of contribute to providing the scientific expertise and also evidence-based recommendations. Cultural diplomacy is kind of is closer to facilitating intercultural dialogue, and with universities to that idea of contributing more to inclusive and globally engaged societies. So I think there are those nuances, and universities are actually, I think, uniquely positioned to bring all these three aspects together, and they can, they can sort of navigate all these multipolar contexts. They can build alliances, and they are affected by geopolitical forces, but they can also respond to them. And the question is, can they influence those sort of global norms that we would like to convey through knowledge, science, and cultural diplomacies? And if they can, that's kind of more ontological question. How do they do it? And the practice dimension. And if they do it in diverse ways. At the same time, I think there's also that normative dimension. Can they promote, specific values such as academic freedom and human rights through their way of being, their way of practicing, and so what are the kind of, I know these are a bit abstract, it's quite difficult to kind of come with solutions when we know how diverse higher education institutions are, when we know the diversity of higher education systems, when we know that the governance structures are very different, and the degrees of institutional autonomy and academic autonomy are also very different. So I think all these parameters have to be taken into consideration, and responses have to people have to work through those principles, and see how these principles can be negotiated in their context. Yeah, so that's
Okay. Thank you, Vasilica. Tim, any reflections on that?
Yeah, I think that's taken us into a really interesting area, and one of the areas that I'm interested in is the relationship between universities and what is quite generally called global science. If we consider global science as the increasing sort of global stock of knowledge that's produced through publication, then we have a body of knowledge that's evolving, that's slowly diversifying with some constraints, but interestingly has largely broken free of sort of national homes. So global science is available globally, obviously within the limits of internet access and so on, but it still remains a fairly monolingual, a fairly SET dominated body of knowledge, and it needs to diversify. It needs to adapt to a multilingual framework. But I do think we're at a very interesting opportunity here, because with artificial intelligence, multilingualism should cease to be a problem. We should be able to function much better in lots of different languages, hopefully, and I think that might help us. The diversity. I mean, universities are intricately implicated in global science because of the publish or perish paradigm that all researchers are aware of, that they have pressure to publish and are constrained to publish within the sort of hierarchical publishing structure that exists at the moment, and that needs to evolve. I think the relationship needs to evolve. The approach to publishing needs to evolve, and the approach to, obviously, open source pressures and so on are going to help us with this. But there's a lot more work to be done, I think. So I think that's going to be really, really important. And it's really heartening to see that that international collaboration has massively increased on published research in the last 40 years, from something like 4.7% to 25.7% of papers published globally, and now international collaborations and bilateral collaborations are about 18% or so on between countries. So it's moving beyond national boundaries, and I think that's a great thing. But there's another step to take us forward, and that is a job of work that I think universities should be involved in, and should take interest in.
And take the lead on. Yeah, that's true. Joe, what about yourself? Any views on that?
Yes, I'm very grateful to Vasilica for bringing to the debate this issue of power, these issues of rights. I mean, Tim's right. International collaboration and publication is now vastly improved. But I have to say that's in part due to some self-interest on the part of those who are doing the publishing, because they get more highly cited the more international the selection of authors that is involved in a particular paper. I think we still have a long way to go. Universities in China or Singapore, where there's huge investment in the knowledge economy, will become de facto authors. It's harder if you are in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. I had a wonderful late colleague at LSE called Professor Tandika Makandaweri, and he used to say, we have the best researchers in Africa, but you have the best libraries, and that's why you end up publishing, because of the emphasis on contextualization, theorization, and so on. I think that is breaking down, but we've got a long way to go, I would say. I'm editor of Oxford Development Studies, a journal that is absolutely fundamentally committed to improving the diversity of its authors and readership. It invests profits back into translating, but it's still into French, which helps parts of Africa, and Spanish, which helps Latin America, but it's not translating into Mongolian or all the other languages that scholars exchange in. So we have got a long way to go. As Tim says, it's getting better, and there are going to be technical solutions around some of these issues. We're heading in the right direction, and going back again to Vasiliki's point around power. When the impetus is coming from below as well as above, that's when you hit the sweet spot. And you have got students all over the world demanding that we decolonize the curriculum, that we think more broadly about things and from different perspectives. And I think that is going to help in the long run us to reach a goal of true partnerships of equivalence, if you like.
Interesting. Yes, I mean, if we move towards the whole idea of global thinking, what Marginson and Rhodes talked about way back when, in terms of universities trying to develop cultures at a multiscalar level, operating in local, national, regional, and global domains. I mean, how are those tensions managed, do you think, now? I mean, that was their prediction about what universities would have to do, and I think they were right, as it turned out, as to where we are. But Vasiliki, have you any thoughts on that in terms of the challenges within this knowledge diplomacy?
Yes, that's a very, very interesting question, Marie. If you would allow me just a small sort of digression, just going back to what Tim and Joe said about the publications and international collaboration. I think I just wanted to say, yes, there is a rise of what we can possibly frame as scientific globalism, that tendency of sort of researchers wanting to work with like-minded researchers who are investigating the same questions and science with no sort of boundaries and so on. But I think there is also a lot of work to do, and I understand the sort of the differential powers within the different contexts. So completely agree on that. But what I wanted to bring to the discussion is that if we have seen progress in terms of scientific globalism, I don't think we have seen sufficient progress in terms of science policy. Science policy generally remains sort of contained within the national container, and also the ways that people look into science policy is sort of really shaped by national methodology. We consider the nation as, the space where all the benefits are going to sort of emerge, or how we're going to assess what justifies the national investment because of the kind of tight links between science seen as national wealth. So I think there is progress to work to do within the sort of the realm of publications and so on, but there is also progress to make in terms of science policy that kind of tries to account for those broader trends instead of trying to measure everything as kind of national capital. On the point of decolonizing the curriculum, I think reflexivity is key. And as I said, we have the privilege of being able to sort of understand how our knowledges have emerged. We can revisit them, we can recognize our errors, we can identify the structures of power. And I think that's probably quite unique in terms of, what universities can do and how they can contribute to that debate. Going to the question of, how we can combine all these different levels of analysis. I think it becomes more and more sort of evident that considering the internationalization sort of mission of the university and its contribution to local communities as opposite. You have, for example, parts in universities, they don't talk to each other because internationalization is considered as, for those who can pay their way in, they're privileged somehow, wealthy students, whereas local communities can be disadvantaged. And that, I think that sort of has created, well, in some respects, slightly artificial sort of division. And the different missions are led by different parts of the university. And I think there is a need to kind of try and understand those students coming to us, coming to universities with whatever their sort of, I'm not trying to ignore their sociocultural context, but I'm saying just creating those oppositions, saying, oh, we are a local university and therefore engaged, or we are sort of a kind of elite or marketized university, and therefore we seek the sort of international students. I don't think that's fruitful, and I think there is work to do to bring these scales together. And it's why initially sort of discussed about, yes, there are territories, there are scales, there are networks, and I think that complex thinking has to kind of become part of the parameters leadership academics work, policy bodies work with.
And the strategic development. Universities think about that in that sort of way. Tim, do you have any views on this, or Joe, or?
Joe, do you want to?
I don't have a lot to say on science policy. It's not my area of knowledge and expertise. On the global-local connection, I think it might be worth saying something going back to cities, which is that the relationship which I presented earlier, which was a highly positive and synchronous one, is not always. So, real estate, which around a university, which lends itself to the student market, can displace local people. It can be advantageous to landlords, but not necessarily neighbors next to big student houses. And so it's not always plain sailing. I think there's also it's also worth picking up on the point that internationally mobile students have replaced perhaps a national elite, which was suppressed during massification or by massification, into a global elite. And it really worries me when I look at just about every university I've been associated with, at the number of scholarships that are there for people from, dare I say it, the global south, from women in India or scheduled caste, or these nominated scholarships, and there's nothing for poor working class people in the home country. And so that does lead to resentment. And, I mean, I've had classes where international students have invited people around to their parents' flat in Mayfair when, the local home students have come from, very modest backgrounds. And so it does create a different kind of tension. And I think we can't ignore that when we're thinking about intercultural dialogue. There's also a kind of interclass dialogue within and across nations that we should also concern ourselves with.
Tim?
Yeah, I mean, coming back to the global local, I think it's universities are an interesting agent in knowledge diplomacy in the sense that they can free themselves to a certain extent from their home base in their home nation, but they are also greatly constrained. And what worries me is that these constraints everywhere seem to be increasing rather than decreasing. So they're subject to geopolitical forces, and we saw this with Russia and Ukraine. We see a limiting of horizons of who universities are able to talk to, and we'll see it again in the light of other fragmenting geopolitical influences. So that's really tricky. And also, if we look at, I'm a great believer, and I believe Joe is a great believer in transnational education as well. And this has become increasingly regulated and increasingly constrained in the UK, which is one of the leading countries in developing really interesting and varied and diverse transnational partnerships, which are of great benefit. And going back to Janet Ilieva's work on the Joe mentioned earlier, and looking at the benefit that the universities are able to have a civic mission, both in their home base and in other bases they consider important to them around across borders. It is becoming increasingly difficult to be innovative, and it seems to me that UK transnational policy, for example, tries to force transnational education into a mold that it just doesn't fit because it doesn't suit the local circumstances that it's operating in many parts of the world. So that's a really, really tricky balance, I think, that universities need to get right. But the other thing is, and coming back to Joe's point about housing and about if you take a university like Exeter, which is at the centre of the economy of the city it lives in, it's the biggest employer, it's the biggest factor of any part of life in that city. It has a tremendous responsibility there, and I don't think all of us as universities are perhaps doing as much as we should to talk about how we interrelate with our civic communities and to talk to our various stakeholder communities in a language that they can relate to. I think that's tricky. I don't think we're particularly good at it. So it's something we need to be developing as universities, I think.
Thank you, Tim. If we move on, I suppose maybe you'll take this one, Tim, in relation to the role that universities have in relation to public diplomacy and that whole sphere in terms of the knowledge, science and cultural diplomacies. What's your reflections on that as to where universities are positioned, can position themselves, should position themselves, or indeed shouldn't, if the case may be?
Should, yes, and they could. They're an important part of it, and I know many colleagues who are very good at communicating in a public diplomacy way to audiences they're addressing, but it is a challenge, and I've always been very interested in the transmission of knowledge in all its forms, and particularly as knowledge gets more and more tacit and more complex within structures of specialization, it's increasingly difficult to communicate, and that can be down the corridor between our social sciences department and our physics department. It's a challenge for all of us and public diplomacy is a useful focus because it gives us that impetus to across those barriers and to think across those divides, if you like. I mean, I read a very interesting article very recently about MIT and a building they put up post-war, which was put up very, very quickly and in a very, very architecturally unsound way. It was a terrible building. It was full of long corridors. Everyone got lost. It was difficult to entry, difficult to exit. And it produced tremendous innovation because everyone was always wandering around the corridors lost and talking to people from different departments. And you know, and the sort of, maybe it's anecdotal stories of how, you know, Nobel Prizes were produced was from sort of those corridor conversations, because they were long, winding corridors. People would walk down and the physicists would meet the humanities professors, and the barriers were crossed. But you have to make a conscious effort to do that. And it's not an easy thing to do, I think.
Yeah, in the public diplomacy realm, it's challenging enough. Joe, do you have any views on that? Or
I do. I think knowledge diplomacy can be part of public diplomacy. I don't think it necessarily should be. I've seen it work in different ways. At the British Council, as Tim will remember, we used to take the equivalent of trade missions out to different countries. Universities would go en masse to a particular country where the UK wanted to develop relationships of various kinds, including academic partnerships. And sometimes it was each university for itself, promoting itself, trying to get students to come to their campus rather than another's. At other times, it was much more about a charm offensive for the UK higher education sector as a whole. I've seen, well, I've watched countries like Germany where they have a separation of arm's length bodies, like the Goethe Institute on Culture and DAAD on Education, and they work in tandem with each other and with government, but with a kind of relative autonomy that allows for perhaps a more arm's length engagement in knowledge diplomacy, and less obviously about Germany's public diplomacy, although of course it is. In France, similarly, so Europe in large measure gets it right. The UK, I've seen ebbs and flows of this. I've seen really brilliant practice of the fostering of epistemic communities of scholars and innovation around particular topics with particular countries. And I've seen quite grubby little trade mission type engagement. So it's not automatically, I don't think, in my view, a good thing.
okay, thank you. Vasiliki, any comment on that in terms of the role in public diplomacy?
Yes, I think very interesting perspectives about this tension. How, you know, what sort of interest do public diplomacy missions convey, or they become a conduit for? Are these sort of public interests, or are they more narrow sort of organizational or even commercial interests? I think these are very good questions, and we can, because simply we understand, I mean, that the nature of funding of higher education is such that in many countries, universities are seen as sort of an industry, whereas in other places where there is more public, more state support, you know, we can sort of maybe be ready to engage that public, that got sort of common vision. I mean, the idea of public diplomacy is I haven't reflected on that very specifically, but maybe because that, to me, the responsibility there is even greater, and the question is of how can this greater responsibility be exercised in kind of challenging times? Are there any essential sort of principles? Can we find some anchors? And I think I would say there are three. The universities have to kind of live by example, be reasonable, and try to do the least harm. So these are important things. So living by example, have to embody the values and the behaviors they want to see in others. Being reasonable would require thoughtful and logical decision making, taking into account various perspectives, and doing least harm. They are here also to minimize negative consequences and prioritize their well-being. So maybe if they want to embrace that dimension, depending on the context, I think it's important to have also to draw those lines as well. So these are my thoughts at the moment.
Yeah, that's great.
To invite the further reflection on this area.
Very interesting. I suppose, Tim, if I was to ask you, how do you think universities are viewed by other international organizations and the role that they play in this multipolar context in terms of research and indeed teaching and learning, and as places of public trust? I mean, what do you see tensions there? Do you see challenges, positive relationships? How do you think it's working at the minute?
It's a really good question, and I think it's actually a very, very difficult question to answer. I think understanding generally of what universities are and what they're there for and what their constraints and opportunities are is probably quite limited outside of universities themselves. Clearly, other organizations see universities as valuable in different ways, and commercial organizations see them as valuable because they can do pre-marketization research or blue sky research that can't be done with narrow commercial interests. So that's interesting. But they're universities are porous institutions. So when we talk about other organizations, they draw many of their expert panels from universities, so the links are very intrinsic. I mean, if we think of the IPCC, for example, most of the experts sitting on that sit in the university as well. So there's that relationship between the sort of developing of global policy on, for example, climate change, and the way that's researched within universities. So it's a very porous and very close linkage in that respect, and I think that's extremely valuable. More could obviously be done, and I think more could be done in terms of universities as thinking of universities as coherent objects, which I don't think they really are. They're quite sort of loose, porous organizations. But if thinking strategically about universities, I think they need to invite a wider range of organizational partnerships, and those with international organizations that span frontiers would be the first port of call, I would have thought, in any sort of strategic link up. So I think there's a lot more to be done there.
Jo, do you have any perspectives on that or reflections?
I think there's always there's a kind of grudging respect. It's not always a love affair between universities and other organizations. I think the way the sector is being regulated means that greater attention now, not only in the UK, but across many countries, greater attention has to be paid to how you engage with the rest of the world as academics. So, if you look at the UK's research assessment, research excellence framework, impact is a huge component of that. and that I believe is coming to Ireland as well and being picked up elsewhere. I think that means that other organizations are being taken seriously by researchers in a way that hasn't existed before, and therefore that mutual respect is building up. Having said that, that's pretty clear for STEM subjects, for science, technology, maths, and engineering, but I'm not so sure that's the case where disciplines in the social sciences might be more socially or politically critical. And that's where I think the relationship becomes one based on great attention.
Thanks very much. Vasiliki, any views on that?
Yes, thanks, Mary. I think it's just the discussion reminds me of a project that we did maybe now 15 years ago with colleagues from across 6 or 7 countries, and we looked into the networks that universities had in different contexts. And I think we started with that assumption that universities are more like ivory towers, and even if we were scholars of higher education, international higher education, we kind of had absorbed all those perceptions or views. And it was very, very sort of impressive and surprising to see the number of networks, the number of partnerships, the value that universities were giving to those partnerships. And of course, I understand that it's also a branding sort of tool. If the university says, I have 200 partnerships with all sorts of institutions and employers and different sectors of society, it's not only because they believe in the value of collaborations, because it's also a branding sort of tool and strategy. And so I think universities are really very conscious of the value of those partnerships, not only because it does help their sort of interests, if we want to see them as kind of narrow interests, but I think at the same time, I think they do value those partnerships. They're very active in doing them. However, I think higher education, there are the different sectors are heterogeneous. Universities are not here to substitute the employers, are not here to kind of substitute the international organizations. And I think what sometimes I'm wondering about is all these demands on universities to become, to sort of diversify more and more their mission. I think regardless, this diversity has to take place because knowledge is no longer produced just within disciplines, but at the same time, the focus and the mission is quite distinct. And I think for me, universities are here kind of for students to kind of go through that self-formation, but through emergence in knowledge, disciplinary knowledge, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary knowledge, and that's a specificity that the university has. So I kind of I recognize all these, the importance of those links, and I think universities do value them, but there is an heterogeneity of missions and where the focus should be for each organization.
Thank you, Vasiliki. And I suppose finally, do you think universities, Tim, are facing a crisis of relevance, of being able to provide the knowledge, science and innovation needed to shape sustainable futures for everybody anchored in social, economic and environmental justice? An easy one to finish off with.
Thanks for the easy one, Maria. I appreciate that. Well, the easy answer is yes. I'll just go back, if I may, just to Vasiliki's point about interdisciplinarity and Joe's point as well about STEM sort of dominating the impact agenda there, and of course a plea for the humanities and social sciences to be taken more seriously in the formation of, for example, the SDGs and so on, and contributing to their delivery. So I think that's part of my approach to answering your question, Marie, of relevance. We do need to be demonstrating more about how the relevance of our work translates into direct social good, and through SDGs, through social transformation, through the understanding of new technologies and the implementation in a more human and way. And of course, as University of London, we run the festival Being Human, and we are a national centre for the humanities. So it's really important to us to keep reinforcing that we are actually all human, and we can approach that through an understanding of what it means to be human through the humanities. So that feeds into this interdisciplinarity, and is, I think, a central responsibility of universities to get this right, to build that. It's perhaps one of the few places where it can really happen, and it's really, really difficult. I know I have many colleagues here in Paris in different French universities who are trying to instill interdisciplinarity and through that convey to the general public about the relevance of their work. And and one of the areas that one of our neighbouring universities, HESAM, is involved in is the study of trauma, and through an interdisciplinary way, and trying to understand how that impacts us all as human beings and how we can work through it. And this is a sort of project and the sort of work that I think contributes to that relevance agenda. But are we part of the breakdown in institutional trust that just seems to be a little bit of a sort of autumn flu syndrome at the moment? Yes, we are, and we keep needing to push back on that.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Vasiliki, have you any views on that?
No, I don't have, I think, much to add. I think interdisciplinarity is maybe something that is quite hard to practice. Even very committed researchers or scholars do see the challenges there, because even the different sort of career tracks, the ways different promotions happen and so on, is quite complicated to be able to recognize those contributions. But I think it's just an aspiration, it's a work in progress, and we just have to keep going.
Okay, thank you, Vasiliki. And Joe, finally, your views on that one.
So, like Tim, I think I hope it is just autumn flu, but a sense that universities are beleaguered, under threat, in a world of social media and facts and alternative facts and truths and individual own truths, that universities feel something of an existential crisis might be understandable, but never before, I think, has it been so vital for experts or specialists or whatever you want to call them to curate and verify and interrogate this multitude of facts that fly around social media and our world and in the mouths of some of our leaders. And they need interrogating, explaining, understanding. And I think universities are ultimately going to remain the institutions that are trusted to do that, even if they're going through a bit of a rocky patch right now.
That's a very, very positive way to conclude. And listen, thank you so much, all of you, we've covered a lot of ground in the last hour and 30 minutes, and it's been really fantastic just to listen to your perspectives and your viewpoints. And I'm going to hand back over to Andreas now.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you very much for this really, really stimulating, very rich talk, I have to say. We've covered so many different themes, from the role of cities and universities for intercultural learning and understanding, and it's and that link between the universities and cities as a special asset. Mobility, internationalization, the ethics of that. There, I'd just like to make a quick note in terms of internationalization and invite you to look at the IU webpage, especially the work of my dear colleague Giorgio Marinoni on internationalization of higher education, because I do think that one aspect maybe we should also raise there is that that internationalization, as it's defined at least by us at the IU, is really the intentional process of integrating an international, intercultural or global dimension into the purpose, function and delivery of higher education. So also to integrate it really within learning and teaching, that aspect I think would be very important to be underscored. Then we also spoke about power. Indeed, Vasiliki, you made a wonderful point there, and the real importance for us to look at access, to look at equity, to look at social justice, to look at aspects of decolonization. Joe, you said that sweet spot between the pressures from above and below, to really identify where that is and to find that niche and operate within it. Science policy, and there it's very important that we do also look at the UNESCO recommendations of open sciences that have been adopted this past year, and I think it really is a way forward for the global discourse on and access to knowledge, which would then overcome some of the national boundaries that we're seeing. And also the transformation of higher education, really. I mean, we've spoken a lot about these very, very different aspects, and I think we are at the moment in a time, Joe Beale, you said a time of crisis, perhaps, but also a huge opportunity to redefine ourselves, reimagine what higher education needs to be in the future. And for that, I'm still coming back to this idea of diplomacy and what that means. And diplomacy, of course, comes from the world of nations, of the nation building, of entities, of national buildings, of politicians at the end of the day. And I'm thinking of 100 years of Max Weber at the end of the First World War, when he was reflecting on the role of science as a vocation, or politics as a vocation, and I can see within our discussion today that we're still trying to differentiate, that we're still trying to find the complexities and the mandate of what makes a scholar a scholar. Thank you very much for this very, very rich discussion today. And I'm very, very sorry also to, I'm sorry that we're running out of time, unfortunately, so it will be difficult to take questions at the end of this very rich conversation, but I hope that the many of the participants will understand and got a lot out of this very rich conversation. Thank you very much, and have a very good week. Thank you. Bye-bye.